Okay, great. Thank you everybody for being here. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the things that Dr. Ellison mentioned at the beginning of the conference. Again, this is our 8th year of doing this, and every year it seems to just get better and better. So thank you all for coming out. Thanks to the students for making this happen. Obviously, this wouldn't happen without you. You did this. This is awesome. Thanks very much to our guests. The papers today have been fantastic. I'd like to thank Dean Breen for her support. Thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Dean. Thanks to Associate Provost Sage for sacrificing his entire Saturday to join us. Really appreciate that support. And just, yeah, thanks to all of you again. And then I'm sure a very special thanks, obviously, to our guest who will be speaking to us today. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Cherry. So I'd like to say a little bit by way of introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Myisha Cherry. Dr. Cherry is currently an associate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, where she joined the faculty in 2018 after finishing her PhD at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Additionally, she holds a Master's of Divinity from Howard University. She has held fellowships at UC Riverside and Harvard, has served on several APA committees, is a wildly prolific author. How exactly it is that she does it, I can't even begin to understand. And in addition to being a prolific author, her work, her academic work, is admirably accessible and clear while maintaining a very rigorous approach. It's truly astounding. She has 20-some academic publications, has recently published a tremendous number of popular philosophical essays, has an edited volume on the moral psychology of anger, is the author of The Case for Rage, as well as Unmuted Conversations on Prejudice, Oppression, and Social Justice, both of which are published through Oxford University Press, and has a third book under contract, and at least as far as I understand, she can correct me if I'm wrong, a draft is complete of her third book, The Failures of Forgiveness, which will be coming out through Princeton University Press. Truly incredible. On top of all of that, as if that weren't enough, Professor Cherry is also the host of the Unmute podcast, has appeared on BET, BBC Radio, TEDx, Huffington Post Live, and more places. And yet all of that just barely scratches the surface of her amazing CV. So it's an absolute joy. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor for me to be able to introduce to you our keynote address today, Professor Myisha Cherry, who's going to be speaking to us on James Baldwin and Black Rage. Please join me in welcoming Professor Myisha Cherry.
Thank you so much, Chris. I hope you all can hear me okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm excited to be with you all today, even though I'm still in California. Thank God for technology, but I'm very excited to be with you all today and to talk about two of my favorite subjects, that being James Baldwin and that being Hebrew. Okay, so let me share my screen here. Okay. So American essayist James Baldwin is said to, throughout his work, penetrate and analyze the rage of being Black in America and convert it into a recognizable human emotion. However, while Baldwin's views on love and shame have received scholarly attention, his views on anger have not. Now, I think this is surprising, given that Baldwin is often described as being very angry. His Cambridge UN debate foe, William Buckley, described him as a tormented writer who celebrates his bitterness against the white community. When a volume of Baldwin's later essays was released in 2010, writer Jeremy McArthur proclaimed he's been dead for 23 years, but Jimmy Baldwin is still angry. His anger still has not gone unnoticed. The lack of scholarly attention to Baldwin's view is also surprising, since Baldwin had lots to say about anger. When scholars do focus on Baldwin and anger, it is usually confined to Baldwin's rhetorical politics of Black anger, rhetoric that Jeffrey Kurtz describes as a civic honesty, tinted by anger about the habits of speech and action that collectively collude to facilitate our collective political death. His thoughts on anger, or more properly put, his account of Black rage is largely ignored. And I think this is an unfortunate reality that must be remedied. Now, what I aim to elucidate in this talk is Baldwin's moral psychology of anger in general and Black rage in particular as seen in his nonfiction. And I'll use anger and rage interchangeably throughout. Now, although the term rage is often used to apply to intense irrational anger, I use Black rage to refer to the anger of Black folk at racism and racists. And in this way, I follow in the tradition of race theorists like Bell Hooks and Cornel West, who use the phrase to describe a specific possessor of anger and a specific target of anger. And I'll show, or hope to show, that Baldwin's thinking is significant for moral psychology and is relevant to important questions at the intersection of philosophy of emotions, race, and social philosophy. It also, I believe, has pragmatic application to present day anti-racist struggle. Overall, my aim is to explore, or to get us to explore, Baldwin's theoretical account of Black rage. And I'll argue that his account dignifies Blacks by centering them as people with agential capacities and provides them with a pragmatic politics of rage that is useful in the fight against white supremacy and racial injustice. So in the first part of this talk, I'll argue that Baldwin provides an elaborative account of Black rage, an account that I believe that is often under-described in the philosophical literature through an exploration and an examination of the Black American experience, while carefully articulating what I believe is a sophisticated cognitive and bodily view of anger along the way. I'll then explain how he reconciles questions of agency with Black rage through his belief of the ever-present role of agency with Black rage throughout its very different phases. And lastly, in the final part of the talk, I'll show how Baldwin can help us respond to ancient and contemporary critics concerned with anger's counterproductivity by examining his distinction between useless and useful anger. So there's a lot to cover here. In Baldwin's collection of essays, Notes of a Native Son, he describes his very first experience of racial discrimination while he was living and working in New Jersey for a brief period of time. As a Northerner, he never thought that people would look at him and expect him to behave the way that they expected Southern Negroes to behave. Not only did he experience racial animosity at the defense plants where he worked, he also faced discrimination at restaurants, bars, and other public places. And it was during this time in New Jersey that Baldwin admits for the first time in his life, he contracted some dread chronic disease. And he describes it as bodily, as a pounding in the skull and fire in the bowels. And he notes its permanence and regularity when he writes, once this disease is contracted, one can never really be carefree again, for the fever, without an instant's warning, can recur at any moment, end quote. Now, Baldwin is not describing a cold, COVID, or a migraine. He's describing his experience of rage. And he suggests that he is not alone in feeling it. He writes, quote, "There is not a Negro alive who does not have this rage in his blood," end quote. It is here that Baldwin moves from simply giving an account of anger at a moral injury to an account of what I'm going to describe as Black rage. Now, anger at moral injury, or any moral injury, can arise in response to a variety of wrongdoings, regardless of its racial nature. And the cause can be a single incident, and it's likely to cool and disappear once that wrongdoing has been rectified. However, Black rage is specific in what it is responding to, and thus it is different. Black rage, at least according to Baldwin, has several causes. Racial mistreatment is the first cause of the rage that every Negro alive has. And this rage hangs over the streets of Harlem like storm clouds as the outraged witness police officers populate their neighborhoods. Black inhabitants have this rage not only because they are surveilled, but also disenfranchised, forced to live in unlivable conditions, and presented with little to no opportunities to escape. It is then not surprising that Baldwin alternates the term Black rage with fury and frustration and rage and despair. However, one shouldn't think that this rage is merely self-referential. Black rage is not only in response to the mistreatment that one as Black experiences, it is also a response to the ever-present mistreatment of other Blacks. Baldwin is clear. He writes, quote, "Part of the rage is this. It isn't only what is happening to you, but it's what's happening all around you all of the time." Now, the use of all of the time is telling. Black rage is a response not only to past harms, it is a response to the continual mistreatment of Blacks. Baldwin also notes that the rage is in response to the most extraordinary and criminal indifference, the indifference and ignorance of the most white people in this country. Now, we must be careful not to lump indifference and ignorance together. Indifference is attitudinal, ignorance is epistemic. So let's briefly address each in turn. While there are whites who directly mistreat Blacks, there are many who witness it with indifference. They lack sympathy and compassion in the face of Black suffering. The other cause is socially epistemic in nature. It is an example of what Charles Mills describes as white ignorance. And Mills credits Baldwin and other 20th century African-American writers with making it a theme in their work. These writers often point out the epistemic asymmetry between whites and Blacks, in which they know whites well, but are rarely seen or known by them. Baldwin notes that Blacks have a bottomless anger because they are forced to learn far more about whites than whites have to learn about them. Knowledge about Blacks is a luxury for whites. On the other hand, knowledge about whites is part of Black folks' survival. As Baldwin describes in this essay, "Nobody Knows My Name," no one in the world knows Americans better than the American Negro. This is because he has had to watch you, outwit you, deal with you, and bear you, and sometimes even bleed and die with you ever since we got here. Now, although Baldwin acknowledges that he has often used the asymmetry as a way to outwit whites and thus survive, the very fact that it exists is cause for the rage. When whites decide to learn about Blacks, this creates Black fury because for Baldwin, this sudden awareness or need to know only highlights the fact that Black people's humanity has occupied so little place in the white man's mind. Now, one comes to have Black rage through a particular epistemic position. Note that Baldwin states that there is not a Negro alive who does not have this rage in his blood. Now, Baldwin means that every Black person has this rage, and the meaning of the claim will still hold absent of the word alive, since it is already presumed that the subject Negro refers to subjects in the present tense. However, I think the use of the term alive is intentional and not redundant. Alive does not refer to physical life, but an enlightened one. Baldwin claims that only Negroes with a certain level of consciousness have this rage, for Black rage is born out of an examined life. An examined life for Baldwin is a life of endless questioning, re-examining, journeying further, honest examination, criticizing, and intellectual activity where one is willing to be pierced by the sword of truth. The subject of examination is oneself and the world. And examine life requires an engagement with the past and the present, learning and understanding through self-appraisal, and then willingness to see through the world of illusions. The primary illusion in America for Baldwin is its exceptionalism. It is an illusion that America actually lives up to the standards that it sets for itself and has achieved freedom in every way. But Baldwin, or Negroes alive, know better. This knowing better, born out of examination, creates an anger, not a bliss or contentment. For Baldwin, as it was for Socrates, an unexamined life is not worth living. Now, it is possible that Blacks who do not have this rage have not lived an examined life. Baldwin, in No Name in the Street, gives an example of this when he recalls gifting the suit that he wore to Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral to an old friend. When he visited him, Baldwin could not understand how nothing seemed to have touched this man. He was, for Baldwin, unknowable about the raging school battle or the anti-poverty program. He seemed little touched by the callous-ism in his house and all around him. And he was, by the male, or one might say, that he was untouched by the callous-ism in his house and everything that was going around him. Baldwin implicitly contrasts his friend with his friend's stepdaughter, who, although was possessed with what Baldwin describes as an indigestible fury, a militancy in which one is angry about things they do not have full knowledge of, she still felt anger at injustice. Their discussion of Vietnam point to the illusion that his friend had accepted, an illusion that arises as a result of an unexamined life and thus produces a non-angry Black man. His friend not only defends the war, but also yells, "Let me tell you what I think we're trying to do there." His use of "we're" is evidence of his unexamined life, for according to Baldwin, not only had his friend bought into America's myth concerning the war, but he had also bought into the illusion that he, as a Black man, is part of the we of America. And this is not to say that Black rage is sufficient for a Black person to live an examined life. Rather, it is to claim that Black rage is born out of an examined life. Recall, there are other things for Baldwin that are necessary for an examined life. They are what epistemologists refer to intellectual courage, attentiveness, honesty, and love, truth. Black rage caused by racial mistreatment and asymmetrical racial knowledge and brought about through an examined life was articulated by Black leaders like the Black Panthers and Elijah Muhammad. And No Name in the Street, Baldwin describes Huey Newton, leader of the Black Panthers, standing in City Hall with a gun, challenging the policeman's gun and their right to be in the ghetto. Baldwin claims that what got the Panthers so much attention and pushback was that they articulated the rage and repudiated the humiliation of thousands and millions of African Americans. Through this rage, they expressed Black America's grievances. Perhaps this is also why Baldwin felt that he knew something about the pain as well as the fury of Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam. Although he considered Elijah's and his own responsibilities to be different, Baldwin, as an alive Black man, understood the fury, for it had the same cause for him and countless others. Now, Baldwin is not claiming that Black rage brought about by these causes is a collective emotion. He is not suggesting the racial group called Blacks have intentional attitudes and thus consciousness. Neither should we take the term Black rage to refer to a single emotion attributed to groups rather than to individuals. Nor is Baldwin claiming that all Blacks experience anger at the same object. Rather, Baldwin is describing an individual emotion that has a variety of causes, and it is not necessarily experienced by all Blacks, for whether one has this rage depends on one's level of consciousness. Black rage, on Baldwin's view, is affective and a cognitive response felt by Blacks who experience and witness the continual mistreatment as well as the indifference to and ignorance of their suffering. This is not to say, though, that Black rage just is an emotion experienced by individual Blacks. Although it is an individual rather than a collective emotion, It arises due to a sense of collectivity and can lead to collective action as historical and present-day social movements highlight. Recall, it comes about due to witnessing the experiences of others. And as we shall see, it is useful in part, according to Baldwin, because of the positive things it communicates to Black folk and for how it leads to collective action with other outraged citizens. However, there are moments in which one's Black rage is cooled, and then there are times in which it reaches a boil, as in the case of Baldwin in New Jersey. Baldwin has ideas about what we can and should do with this cool and boiling rage. And in doing so, I believe that he illuminates the agential capacities that Blacks have in the various angry stages. And he does it in ways that counter negative stereotypes of them as well. So let's talk about how to choose to live consciously or to surrender to this rage. If Black rage is present and every Black person that is alive due to these causes, then what is the place of agency in Baldwin's account of Black rage? That is, do Blacks have the capacity to act and to choose given the presence of Black rage? So what I want to do, I want to argue that consistent with Baldwin's belief in human possibilities, he thinks that we have agency at every phase of Black rage. In the notes of a Native Son passage previously cited, Baldwin continues, he writes, "It, that is Black rage, can wreck more important things than race relations. One has the choice merely of living with it consciously or surrendering to it." Now, I interpret to live consciously with this rage to mean to have it under control. To surrender to it means to allow rage to control you. Now, while the first option allows for agency, agency may sound puzzling in a context in which rage controls the subject. For this reason, I want to give attention to the ways in which one might surrender to rage and examine to what extent agency has a place. Now, Baldwin provides two examples of what it is to surrender to rage. In the first example, the angry agent engages in a violent, revengeful act that could result in his or his target's death. On Baldwin's last night in New Jersey, after experiencing many instances of racial mistreatment there, he says that he wanted to do something to crush these white faces, which was crushing me. So he walked into a restaurant with the anticipation that he would be discriminated against. As the waitress told him that they did not serve Negroes, all of his fury flowed towards her. His Black rage had reached a boil. He notes, "I hated her for her white face and for her great, astounded, frightened eyes. I felt that if she found a Black man so frightening, I would make her fright worthwhile." After realizing that he could not get close enough to grab her neck, he picked up a water pitcher and threw it in her direction. After throwing it, he seemed to come out of his rage, describing it as a frozen blood abruptly thawed, and he was able to escape the restaurant with his life. The second example of surrendering to rage occurs in his essay, "The Devil Finds Work." Now, in this example, the angry agent engages in a verbal act that, given her vulnerability to white violence, could result in her death. To support Baldwin's view that the movie Lady Sings the Blues has nothing to do with Billie Holiday, Baldwin described a scene from the movie that is not in the book. At a stop on the road with her bandmates, Billie sees a group of Blacks grieving as a Black body hangs from a tree. Soon after, the Ku Klux Klan appears, marching on the main street nearby. Billie, filled with rage upon viewing the lynched body, makes herself visible and curses at the Klan. Like Baldwin, her and her white bandmates are able to escape. Now, Baldwin thinks that this encounter did not happen, not only because it's not in the book, but because he writes, "One of the necessities of being Black and knowing it is to accept the hard discipline of learning to avoid useless anger and needless loss of life. Every mother and his mother's mother's brother is needed." Now, while Baldwin is correct to point out that the scene's inconsistencies is from the book, the fact that it should not happen doesn't support the fact that it did not happen. Recall, Baldwin also surrendered to his anger. However, and more importantly, I think Baldwin is making a normative claim. Consciously living with anger, that is, controlling it, requires us to avoid useless anger. Surrendering to anger, that is, allowing it to control you, can result in a loss of Black life. And this should not happen because every Black life is needed. Given what Blacks know about whites, they know better, for they are, according to Baldwin, schooled in adversity long before white people are. They perceive danger far more swiftly. They know their white comrades' brothers far better than the comrade does. Before elaborating on this useless anger that Baldwin references, I think it's worth examining the agency involved and living with the rage consciously and surrendering to it. Note Baldwin's use of choice in the above passage. He thinks that we have a choice to either control our anger or allow our anger to control us. But this picture is too simplistic. At what point do we have a choice? Now, the Stoic Seneca thinks that anger undergoes a three-stage process. In the first stage, the emotion begins without reason being involved. Indeed, he thinks that the first stage should not even be called anger since the agent is experiencing an impression, not what he calls a passion. It is what he describes as an involuntarily bodily movement, no more anger than the impression itself. In the second stage, the emotion comes into being and reason can operate here with the agent choosing to resist or surrender to it. And here, for Seneca, anger appears. It is born from deliberation and can be eradicated by deliberation. And in the third stage, anger is fully developed and is beyond the capacity of control. Seneca writes, it desires vengeance, having overthrown reason. Seneca thinks that choice is only occurs in the second stage. The second stage seems to fit with Baldwin's simplistic picture, void or surrender. But is there choice on Baldwin's view and the other stages? Baldwin's account of the relationship between the examined life and Black rage rejects Seneca's first stage view. For Baldwin, we come to be angry by living an examined life. And this is not to say that we can think ourselves into the emotion, that we should fully reject Baldwin's disease metaphor. Rather, it acknowledges that reason is not fully absent in the first stage. On the other hand, the New Jersey restaurant incident seems to support Seneca's third stage view. Baldwin writes, when we re-entered the streets, something happened to me, which had the force of an optical illusion. I felt a click at the nape of my neck, as though some interior sting connecting my head to my body had been cut. The sound of the pitcher crashing, my frozen blood abruptly thawed. I returned from wherever I had been. I saw for the first time. Now, this description seems to illustrate, at least in somatic terms, that Baldwin is being controlled by his anger. Something has happened to him. Once anger is fully developed, does Baldwin then think that we lack control? Now, if Baldwin thinks that every Black person alive already has Black rage, he would not also remind them of their choice if he did not think that they had the capacity to control it. Unlike Seneca, anger is not beyond our control for Baldwin. While both writer Richard Wright and Baldwin understood that to be a Negro is to be enraged almost all the time, and both aimed to express it, Baldwin had a solution. He writes, the first problem is how to control that rage so that it won't destroy you. Baldwin thought that although we may have Richard Wright's main character, Bigger Thomas, a private Bigger Thomas lived in the skull, we are not doomed to failure. He believed that the real psychological situation of Blacks is that they are always faced with a choice. Now, one might object by suggesting that the worry for Baldwin is not anger, but express anger. Perhaps every Black person alive does have a rage inside of them, but if they let it out, they will be controlled by it. However, I think that this contradicts Baldwin's admonishments for Blacks to express their anger. It was unexpressed anger, anger that remained bottled up, never expressed to its target, that was problematic for Baldwin. And he notes that inarticulate rage was all the more dangerous because it was unexpressed and therefore it could turn into bitterness. Does Baldwin think that there's a lack of agency in the boiling Black rage? Insofar that you can describe yourself, as he did, as having been enraged, that you can recount it afterwards as he did, and reflect on how you felt, and you are agentially contributing to the action, and thus have some kind of at least minimal agential capacity. On this view, Baldwin does not think there's a lack of agency even in what we describe as boiling rage. Baldwin is able to relive the moment over and over again, like an automobile accident. He acknowledges that he has no conscious plan, but he was aware of what he wanted to do, which was to crush these white faces. Baldwin is also able to reflect on his attitudes. He writes, "I had been able to commit murder," end quote. Note that Baldwin never criticized his outraged state, as if it is to blame for taking away his power to act otherwise. Instead, Baldwin criticizes himself for surrendering to the emotions and attitudes involved in the state. He writes, quote, "My life, my real life, was in danger, and not from anything other people might do, but from the hatred I carried in my own heart." It was hatred he chose to carry, just like he chose to enter the restaurant, to touch the waitress with his hands, etc. And this ability to choose and to act does not ignore his bodily experience, but it explains that both can be present at the same time for Baldwin. In sum, on my reading of Baldwin, there is a capacity to choose throughout Black rage's several phases, including the kind of boiling rage that he experienced. Anger is not something that we are overcome by and cannot control. Rather, it is something within our control and from which deliberative action is engendered. We are not fated to one kind of anger. We have a choice to engage in a useless or useful kind, and thus useless or useful action. As we shall see, it is this agential capacity that makes it possible for Blacks to protest, criticize, and create through rage. More specifically, Blacks who have this anger also have control. So contrary to stereotypes of Blacks as irrational and out of control, Baldwin attributes agency to them in ways that humanize and dignify them as rational beings through his theoretical account. Now that we know what we can do with Black rage, what then should we do? Now I want to give attention to Baldwin's useless anger. And I'm going to argue, according to Baldwin, that what Blacks should avoid, and a valuable concept that reveals a target of anger skeptics concerned with anger and productivity. More importantly, I think it provides Blacks with a pragmatic politics of rage that can be used in the service of anti-racism struggle. Let me first begin by providing a preliminary account of what useless Black rage involves. Baldwin does not claim that Black rage is useless and therefore should be avoided. On the contrary, he claims that it can become useless, and when it is, it should be avoided. Black rage is not by definition useless. Black rage can be useless and it can be useful. And it is up for us to decide which version we choose. His two examples of surrendering to rage provides a window into the nature of useless anger. So based on the Holiday in New Jersey example, we might conclude that useless anger is anger that can get you killed. And if this is the case, then Baldwin and the fictitious Billie Holiday did in fact experience useless anger, given that they barely escaped death after their angry episodes. But this can't be the whole story. The anger of Malcolm X and the Black Panthers could have also gotten them killed, but Baldwin never describes them as experiencing useless anger. The anger that he ascribes to Malcolm in particular is what he describes as unfamiliar rage, a rage that articulated a love for Blacks, an apprehension of the horror of the Black condition, and a determination that his beloved would be empowered to change their own condition. Now, I want to argue that according to Baldwin, Black rage is useless, not when it welcomes death, but when it contains hate. In the Athens, New Jersey restaurant incident, Baldwin could not get over two facts. He could have had killed and he could have been killed. But we ought not to take Baldwin's point to be solely focused on death. Additionally, he notes that this could have occurred not because of what others did, but because of his own hatred. So I take Baldwin's concern not to be with the overwhelming power of anger, but instead with one's capacity to hate others and oneself through anger. Baldwin acknowledges that the hate that Blacks have for whites is different from the hate whites have for Blacks. The former is not born out of superiority, but the need, in his words, to get the white man off his back. Nevertheless, for Baldwin, this hate can have a murderous power over you. He calls this a self-destroying limbo, a limbo from which he could not write. And it is this self-destroying state that he had witnessed his father succumb to, and one he strove to resist. Anger is useless for Baldwin, not when it prevents one from being heard, or when it's less digestible to whites or the powerful, or when it doesn't lead to reform. It is useless when the anger contains hate. Such a hate can lead to physical and existential death. So we ought not take Baldwin's caution against useless anger to be an indictment against Black rage in general. Now, this view stands in contrast to the counterproductive argument tradition of William Buckley, Seneca, and more recently, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. In her 2018 paper, The Atlas of Anger, Myisha Srinivasan gives attention to the 1965 Cambridge UN debate between Buckley and Baldwin. Buckley argues against Baldwin's politics of anger because it focuses on the past, on what has been done. However, it doesn't turn its gaze towards the future. Buckley writes, Negroes have done a great deal to focus on the fact of right discrimination against Negroes. They have done a great deal to agitate a moral concern, but where, in fact, do they go now? He also claimed that this anger also leads to self-destruction and can motivate white violence. It's for these reasons that he believed that it was counterproductive. Now, Buckley joins a long tradition of anger skeptics. Seneca believed that anger aims at destruction. He writes of anger, it is above all other emotions, hideous and wild, raging with an utterly inhumane lust for arms, bloods, and tortures. Anger is a short madness, for it's equally devoid of self-control, forgetful of kinship. And he goes on and on and on. Seneca is claiming that anger makes a person out of control, and his anger is likely to lead to revenge and also break important bonds. And Martha Nussbaum, influenced by Aristotle, thinks that anger is irrational because it conceptually has this vengeful picture, this vengeful hope rooted in the thought that one can actually undo what has already been done through revenge. Therefore, she claims that the best way to achieve a just society is through love and generosity, not through anger. And they are our best options because contrary to anger, they are not status focused, nor are they backward looking, but focused on the future. Srinivasan also argues there's more to anger, normatively speaking, than its effects. Taking on what she calls a moderate functionalism view, in which she admits that anger has typical behavior expressions and can be altered by cultural programming. Srinivasan claims that we should not ignore anger's aptness, even when it's counterproductive. In her view, the fact that anger could be counterproductive does not provide us with decisive reasons not to get angry. But another point is worth mentioning here. Srinivasan continues by claiming that Buckley and other critics' real target is not anger after not, but it's stereotypical expressions. That is to say, that their worries are directed towards stereotypical angry behavior, violently or seemingly out of control expressions of anger, for example. However, I do not think that anger skeptics like Buckley, Nussbaum, even Seneca's real target. It's only anger stereotypical expressions. There are times in which we are angry and vengeful expressions are not part of the picture. Being angry with our children or friends is an example. I also do not think that Baldwin is concerned with anger stereotypical expressions, as I have already expressed. The expressions will be, all things considered, the same, whether it is useless or useful anger. For example, Billie Holiday, when angry, might curse at the television just as she cursed at the Klan. Baldwin, when angry, might throw a pitcher of water on a garden lawn just as he threw a pitcher at the white waitress. The worry for anger skeptics, as well as Baldwin, cannot be reduced to expression. What Baldwin's work highlights is that the real target is a protracted anger, which tends towards hatred, and is then manifested in schemes of retaliation and vengeance. From Baldwin's view, what is the difference between useful and useless anger is the presence of hate in the latter. This is not merely an expressive, counterproductive issue for Baldwin. More importantly for him, it's an internal counter-love issue. Baldwin's criticism of anger appears only when it is tied to hate. So hear him at length from an essay called Talk to Teachers. What I'm trying to get at is that by the time the Negro child has had effectively almost all the doors of opportunity slammed in his face, and there are very few things that he can do about it. He can more or less accept it with an absolute, inarticulate, and dangerous rage inside. All the more dangerous because it is never expressed. It is precisely those silent people whom white people see every day of their lives. I mean, your porter and your maid, they really hate you because in their eyes, and they're right, you stand between them and life. Black rage is not dangerous when it rises in intensity. It is dangerous when it contains hate. Hatred for whites and self-hatred. This is useless anger for Baldwin, and useless anger should be avoided. So what can we infer about useful anger on Baldwin's account? Rather than containing hate, useful Black rage contains love. It involves expressions, or it expresses love of Black people, a love that also involves affirming and valuing Black life without giving in to the hate and supremacy that befalls white races. Now, it must be noted that hatred towards whites does not necessarily suggest a love for Black people. Baldwin admits in the essay Autobiographical Notes that his hatreds of whites did not mean that he loved Black folks, for he once despised them for failing to produce the great artists of all times. On the other hand, useful Black rage both avoids hatred of whites and involves a love for Blacks. Writer Bell Hooks criticizes philosopher Cornel West for his depiction of Malcolm X's Black rage because she thinks that because West makes rage synonymous with great love for Black people, and by collapsing Malcolm X's rage with love, West attempts to explain that rage away, to temper it. For Hooks, Malcolm X's rage was not just about love, it was about his commitment to justice. So one could ask, is my reading of useful Black rage vulnerable to Hooks's criticism? Well, I do not think that collapsing or connecting anger with love is necessarily an act of tempering the rage. The strength of the temper accusation would depend on one's view of love. The love that Baldwin had in mind was not a kind that would successfully temper the rage. Rather, it makes it much more revolutionary, by which I mean it counters the status quo and their dominant values and focuses on resistance and freedom. Now consider that Baldwin thought that Negroes in this country are really taught to despise themselves from the moment that their eyes are open to the world, he writes. Political theorist Chris LeBron remarks on Baldwin's love and stance as follows. He says, love requires an investment of mind, but also of spirit. Racial oppression and abuse tend to motivate a person to turn the attention of the oppressed and the abused on herself. This broadly leads to despair, and despair can subsequently manifest self-hatred and self-pity. Love, I believe, can undo this despair and prevent the abuse. Thus, any decolonial project will entail a call to love in order to undo colonial destruction and assert humanity and hope for the disenfranchised, amongst other things. Black theologian James Cone reminds us that loving Blackness undermines white supremacy. Even Hooks in later chapters in her book, Kill Racism, motivates the ideal of Blackness as political resistance, claiming that Black rage is useful when it involves or expresses a love for Black people. It's not a move to temper the rage. It reveals just how radical and useful that rage is, since the very idea is resistant and a refusal enterprise. So in this sense, we might be tempted to think that Baldwin's account of Black rage is an example of what Nussbaum describes as transition anger. Unlike garden variety of anger, which on her account is status focused and involves payback wish, transition anger does not contain a desire for retribution, but rather it always extends to the wrongdoer, a generous type of love, and a hope for a future of cooperation and constructive work. While she admits that transition anger lacks the retributive wish and can be used in the service of social goals, she thinks that it's really practiced in its pure form. When she writes in her 2016 book, Anger and Forgiveness, about revolutionary leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, she notes, quote, to the extent that any of them admitted anger as acceptable, it was either our borderline species of transition anger, sense of outrage without any wish for ill to befall the offender, or else a brief episode of real anger, but leading quickly to the transition. However, her account of transition anger, I believe, is too focused on the wrongdoer. And in this way, it differs from Baldwin's account of Black rage. Nussbaum's transition anger overemphasizes extending sympathy, respect, friendship, and generosity to the wrongdoer. Baldwin's account of Black rage, however, helps us to see that anger is not merely about extending love to a white wrongdoer, but to the Black person who has been wronged. It's not just about hoping in a cooperative future with the wrongdoer, but hoping in the Black person who was wronged. To put it bluntly, Baldwin's account of Black rage decenters whiteness and places Black life at its center, and is able to do it in a way that escapes hatred and disrespect. Useful Black rage is also critical. Anger is a form of protest against wrongdoing. Protest is not simply an appeal to white sympathy or a demand that whites give Blacks what they deserve. Protest is about announcing wrongdoing, expressing disappropriation, and holding others to account. Baldwin uses his vocation as a witness and his Black rage to criticize her, which is America, perpetually. He uses Black rage to accuse my country and my countrymen that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it or do not want to know it. And in doing so, his Black rage was useful. We can also apply this aspect of criticality and usefulness to the interpersonal. And her account of anger as a political emotion, philosopher Celine Leboeuf uses Frantz Fanon as a point of analysis when she argues that rage can awaken him to his oppression, but it also sets the stage for reflections on racism that transcend the desire for revenge. And she notes that even if it is impure, as Nussbaum describes, it can still be instrumentally valuable because it opens up a space for questioning racist societies. Its value rests on its effects on the psychology of the oppressed, among other things. And I agree. In the case of Baldwin, useful anger is not only anger brought about by an alive consciousness, but it rests on the effects that this questioning and examination has on the Black person. In addition, this question also becomes useful since it is a prerequisite to social action. Action that is rarely engaged alone, but instead undertaken in solidarity with other outraged citizens who are motivated to act because of the rage. Baldwin writes, quote, "I'm not a doom monger. If you don't look at it, you can't change it. You got to look at it," end quote. Useful Black rage is also creative. Baldwin knew that his rage was useless when he was unable to write. Recall that it was the self-destroying limbo of hatred and fear from which he could not create. We can therefore infer that useful rage was the anger that allowed him to write. This creative Black rage hit him while in Paris, looking at a picture of 15-year-old Dorothy Counts, who was attacked by a white mob on her way to school in Charlotte, North Carolina. Although he would stay in Europe another year. Baldwin's self-described fury brought about by the image is what would eventually lead him to what he calls pay his dues, visiting the South to bear witness and record his account and thoughts in such works as No Name in the Street. When he recounts Billie Holiday's rage, what makes it useless for Baldwin is his hatred. What would make it useful, at least in part, will be its motivating force and the creation of her bittersweet tune, Strange Fruit. Baldwin acknowledges that protest literature like Richard Wright's native son, Angry Writing, was useful and that it allowed him for the first time in his life to see express, quote, the sorrow, the rage, and the murderous bitterness which was eating up my life and those around me, end quote. And he admits that Wright's work was an immense liberation and revelation for him. However, Baldwin's criticism of Native Son was not that Wright used anger to create literature. As, quote, one of the last angry productions that recorded his days of anger, Native Son's overwhelming limitation, according to Baldwin, its depiction of Blacks in a fantastic and fearful image with no tradition or social connections. The image of the fictitious Bigger Thomas presented a certain picture of Black rage that fed into myths of monstrous Blacks who all had the inevitable potential of violence. Such a myth provided moral immunity from individual and collective responsibility. In other words, it falsely illustrated a Black rage that was absent of agency and lacked love and creativity. It depicted a false view of Black rage as pathological and always useless. Note that Black rage usefulness does not depend on its ability to bring about reform. Black rage, with its love, criticality, and creativity, is useful because it communicates disapprobation of injustice and it affirms love and value of and solidarity with Black people. While Black rage may be criticized for discouraging uptake by whites, inciting white violence, or being merely cathartic and not politically efficacious, Baldwin helps us to see that its usefulness cannot be measured solely in terms of political contributions. He shows that Black rage is useful when it satisfies other purposes. Now, what is the relationship between agency and this useful anger? Black rage, like other, or Black folk with Black rage, like other moral agents, are able to deliberate and to act, and thus make their anger useful, from which they can then use that to value others, protest oppressive conditions, and ultimately change their world. It's this ability to choose that Baldwin calls our attention to. He highlights how Black agency is revealed both in Black's ability to not be controlled by anger, as well as to choose what their anger would do in the world. Black rage is not just something Black folk can feel, it is also a way to act in the world. Baldwin reminds us that Black rage is a way to respond to the world in a critical, loving, and creative way, all in the service of dismantling the racial causes and conditions for us. And in doing so, Baldwin not only defends an emotion, but also Black life and Black people's moral and political possibilities. So I want to conclude here by noting that I am very excited that anger as a philosophical topic is undergoing a resurgence in philosophy. Moral psychologists are exploring the nature and the function of anger. Political philosophers are exploring its role in public life, and ethicists are examining its aptness, virtue, and vices. As philosophers explore these themes, it's important for them to not only have conversations with each other, but also to rely on the work being done in the empirical sciences and then the humanities. And I think among the humanists that we can benefit from is James Baldwin. As a writer who explored the complexities of the Black experience and the white supremacy that inflicts it, Baldwin had a lot to say about the anger of Black folk and has a unique gift of combining both the empirical and the theoretical in a way that not only provides answers to philosophical questions concerning anger, proposes important ones as well. Baldwin helps us to understand the nature and the causes of a unique type of anger of the oppressed. He also helps us to recognize our agential capacities at each angry stage. And he helps us to make use of guidelines to evaluate and to use the emotion. In addition, he helps us to see the connection between self-examination, criticality, emotions, and agency. Through an examination of oneself and a racist world, an anger is born, that is Black anger or Black rage. And this anger contributes to a criticality that is necessary for reporting the results of one's examination, for challenging others to see and to live differently. Throughout this process of anger, however, the conscious person with Black rage has not necessarily lost control. Rather, she is experiencing or exercising her agential capacities and is capable of using her anger in useful ways as she struggles against anti-Black racism. But Baldwin's contribution is not simply a theoretical one. As racial injustice and anti-Black racism continue to manifest itself in the United States, many Blacks have responded with anger. Although their anger is a fitting response to such wrongdoing, many have criticized their anger, often alluding to its backward-looking focus, its tendency towards violence, and its inability to persuade the powerful to give in to angry people's demands. And this presents a dilemma for the racially oppressed. Should they hold on to their anger without guilt or use it for change? Or should they make attempts to replace it with more positive emotions like love and compassion? Baldwin is a wonderful resource for thinking the first option is worth our consideration. He helps us to see that Black rage is not pathological. It is rational, warranted, inclusive, and useful. He also helps us to see that Black people who are angry are not necessarily out of control, selfish, or ignorant. And Baldwin's work enriches our view of an emotional experience as well as the moral and political conditions that create it by converting it, that is Black rage, into a recognizable human emotion, while also making those who feel it recognizable as moral and political agents. And I think that we are indebted to him for such a contribution. Thank you.